Hello, guys, and welcome back to Chat with the Mindful Beekeepers, our weekly question and answers. And I'm your host, Nathalie B, and I'm with Les Crowder here. We're going to talk to you guys about bees and leverage our expertise over 60 years altogether combined. Les has got most of it, over 50 years. He's the expert. He's the bee guru, and I'm just a master beekeeper from Texas A&M with 10 years only. So we are here to discuss a theme tonight, and then we're going to take your questions. You can just ask them whenever you want to. Feel free to add them to your comments, and if you have missed it today or you can't stay until the end, then you can just watch the replay when we're done. We post those every week. So if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. That will help us propagate that message, and click the little bell so that you can get notified when we have new content and when we are going live. So Les Crowder, you don't need any introductions. You are the author of Top Bar Beekeeping Organic Practices for Honeybee Health. And again, you've done this for as long as I've been alive. And you are now from New Mexico. You came to Texas. And today, we're going to talk about your theme for the day, which is basically talking about other pollinators and native bees and how the honeybees can impact them and how they interact potentially. And if there's an issue with honeybees being in the United States because they were not native originally. And I see some friends. Before I let you talk, Les, I want to say hi to my friend Brad, to my friend Steve, Richard is here, Sherry, Kathy's here, right? Sarita and Larry, I know you've been having some connection issues. It's good to see you all. And I think on Zoom we've got Suburban Southbuster. Monty is with us, and Monty is with us, and it's awesome to have him. He's got a fantastic channel focusing on layers, hives, and education. So welcome everybody, and let's welcome, and let's talk about our theme while people are thinking about their questions.
Okay, well, what brought it up was I posted something that said, I basically shared something that somebody had already said about how their neighbors are very concerned about birds and how much they love to hear the birds sing. And then they were thinking in their mind, but then why are you spraying your lawn? Because you're killing all the insects that the birds eat. And you're basically killing the birds when you spray your lawn. If you love birds, and we've spent a lot of money with bird seed and bird seed feeders, and we try to attract birds. Ducks Unlimited spends millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, enhancing duck habitat. And yet, the other end of the problem is that we do kill so many insects with poison, and that's the baseline for the birds. In some ways we can see life is built on a mat of microbes that supports a certain amount of arthropods, supports a certain amount of reptiles, amphibians, and then eventually a few mammals. But we all depend on that mat below us to build that triangle. And if we weaken the bottom of the triangle, the tower could fall, It needs a nice wide base. And so what can we do to shore up the base? We need to reverse what they call the insect apocalypse. And when I posted that, they say, somebody said, well, what we need to do is plant more native gardens. And then we had some people write and say, okay, you shouldn't have used the word native because you're a nativist, and that's terrible because a lot of these so-called invasive species turn out to be a really good thing, and it's all good. The more we mix up species, the better. And obviously it became this big thing, just like we do in a lot of things. The nativists against the it doesn't matter. And the thing is that there are obviously examples of invasive species that were detrimental. There are islands where birds like the blue-footed booby rested on the islands and nested on the islands and didn't have predators and could easily raise their babies. And then we introduced rats to the island, and they took over, and the blue-footed boobies could not breed because the rats ate all their eggs. And so that's an invasive species that's detrimental to the native population. Honeybees came to the United States from Europe, well, and Africa, and eventually from Asia and all over. And they were not native here. There are fossils, or there is a fossil, I should say, from Nevada of a honeybee. So that there apparently were honeybees in the Americas a very long time ago, millions of years ago. But when the Europeans discovered the Americas for themselves, they did not find any native honeybees. There was stingless social bees in the Mexico and tropical America, but there were no native honeybees. And they brought them in. In many cases, they didn't do very well. The ones in Mexico tended to just slowly peter out and go away. First of all, they brought very few, so that their genetic base was very limited. Their genetic diversity was very small. And then they weren't well adapted. They were adapted to Spain or to England. They weren't adapted to the New World at all. And there weren't a lot of flowers that were ready for honeybees. Now, the thing is, we didn't just bring honeybees. We also brought alfalfa, sweet clover, a whole series of plant seeds that we planted. And we took a bunch of plant seeds, and like potatoes were first discovered in Central and South America. Tomatoes were a crop that the Europeans didn't know and brought back from the Americas. So it just became this exchange of genetic material across the Atlantic Ocean, and it was completely unregulated at first, right? I mean, it was just whatever people thought, well, that could be interesting. And so if it was accidental, tumbleweeds came to the United States as seeds wrapped up in clothing or in sheep's wool, and got started and became kind of a noxious weed. And all might serve a purpose. Tumbleweeds are great at pioneering bare land and putting a little bit of organic matter in it, and then preparing the land for another species to come along that can take the better soil and keep building it. So in some ways we can look at it and say it all had a purpose, but we do have to be careful. And as beekeepers, our goal isn't to obviously exterminate the feral bees or the wild bees or the native bees. I want to see carpenter bees and bumblebees and sweat bees and all the little bees and all the wasps, which are just basically close cousins of bees. Many of those wasps are predatory. They're amazing. They're beautiful, and they're in steep decline. But nobody's paying attention because they don't belong to anybody. Nobody's making any money with them or has a pollination contract to bring a bunch of tarantula hawk wasps to California. But honeybees make money, and therefore we pay attention to their populations. It turns out that the one thing that's been measured recently was that honeybees are living about half as long as they used to back in the 50s, or the 70s, excuse me. So I can verify that it used to be a lot easier to keep bees alive in a beehive than it is now. These days, it's much harder. There's much more problems. Of course, there's mites, but there's also so many pesticides that are not up at the toxic level, but they're subacute. And the problem is that then it takes very little bit more or a little bit of disease, and the bees collapse because they're already struggling. They're literally choking on pesticides in the environment. We know, for instance, that Roundup, even though it's just a herbicide, it affects the bees' gut microbiome. It affects human gut microbiome. It probably affects the gut microbiome of all animals with a digestive tract. And it adversely affects bees' microbiome in a way that causes the bees to use up valuable enzymes to detoxify their body, to try to get rid of the Roundup in their bodies. And then that means they're depleted when other toxins come along, and there's plenty of others. We are increasing the amount of toxicity of the planet continuously. I see you raised your hand.
Yeah, so Brad wanted to know, you mentioned something about bees living 50% of what they used to live now. And Brad is asking if basically that means that the bees would live up to 12 weeks before instead of 6 weeks.
Well, I found a study and I misplaced, I had it in mind for today, and I cannot re-find it. And it's somewhere in my own computer, but I'll find it, and that's a good question. This was just a study claiming that they checked the longevity of bees back in the 70s, the longevity of worker bees, and they checked it very recently in, I think, 2019, and it had almost been cut in half. So that would mean that they're living shorter time now than they used to. So if our research was based on old research, it needs to be redone. But I'll find it because it's important. It was a university study.
Hey,
Canada.
Les Richard has posted a link that I think it's from the newscientist.com. It's an article titled "Honeybees Are Living Half as Long as They Were 50 Years Ago." That's it. Very good. Thank you. So
people who are good at a computer amaze me.
thank you, Richard.
Yes, thank you very much. Because I found that a study, somebody had sent it to me, and then I lost my way to track it down. And I can get lost in the computer better than anybody. I'm great with bees. I feel very at home out in the bee yard. When I get in the computer, I get a bit lost.
Yeah, well, that happens, to the best of us, right?
Well, yeah, it's not I'm biological more than technological, but
Oh, by the way, you guys know that Les is a biologist. He had university training in biology, actually. So when he's talking about this is right up your alley, right, Les?
Well, it is. It always was. The reason I took biology at the university was because I've always been interested in animals and plants and how they fit together and how we kind of build each other up. And even the role of predators. I likened it to somebody recently. They said, well, predators are bad. Well, they serve a purpose. They glean the edges, they trim the ragged edges of a species, right? The Veromite is cleaning the ragged edges of the bees. And what I liken it to is I drive around as a beekeeper, I notice flowers, and I'm likely to slow down and stare at the flowers and wonder what that is and see if I can pull over and see if there's any bees on it, because that's just my nature. Well, if I'm driving around Texas, I'm driving real slow looking at flowers. Most of the people in Texas are not driving real slow. They're driving pretty fast. I find most Texans.
Why are you looking at me like this?
No comment.
He's ridden with me before, that's why.
Most Texans view the speed limit as a minimum suggestion instead of a speed limit.
Brad is agreeing with you.
Yeah, but But so it's the people behind me that keep me up to speed. If nobody was behind me, I'd slow down, and I'd be getting out and looking at flowers and forgetting where I was going, and I wouldn't get there.
It's the ADHD, Les. It's the ADD that does that.
It is ADHD, it's extreme ADHD, but that's the role of predators, to keep you on your focus and keep you on your goal and keep your game tight.
I'm not a predator.
No. But that's so predators serve a purpose, and we often fight them. We want to exterminate them. We almost exterminated the wolf. Interestingly, we tried to exterminate the coyote and actually doubled its population, because coyotes respond to hunting by upping their birth rate. And they're also just so daggum adaptable that literally after Arizona tried to exterminate the coyote, it doubled their population, partly because the wolf had been extirpated from Arizona. So that gave more room for the coyote to expand. But as far as bees go, what do we do with our bees to keep our bees from being invasive species? Well, first of all, we recognize that our bees are often pollinating European crops and African crops. Like in Jamaica, there's all kinds of trees that were not native to the island of Jamaica, but the Africans brought them over. The ackee tree, the mango trees, every kind of tree you can think of, tropical fruit tree was brought there, and honeybees are pollinating those trees, same as they were pollinating them back in their home continents. So honeybees are not in some ways directly competing with native bees. Now there are some cases, like for instance, mesquite is a native plant that was pollinated by native bees, and then honeybees began to pollinate that. But the thing about mesquite is that there are literally miles of it in the deserts. And so where we have a little concentration of honeybees, it's not likely to be spread over all the miles, and there's still plenty of room for the natives. And there are plenty of flowers that the natives don't work, that only honeybees work. As a matter of fact, honeybees are the quintessential pollinators of large flowering trees. There were no very large flowering trees except in the Central and Tropical Americas, because there wasn't a good pollinator for them. So like we have honeybees pollinating peaches, almonds, apples, all these fruit trees that were also European or Asian or African. The Spanish brought peaches to the natives, and the natives valued, the Navajos, for instance, had peach trees in Canyon de Chelly that they valued extremely well and took very good care of until Kit Carson came, and Kit Carson recognized this almost spiritual connection that the Navajos had with the peach trees, and he cut them down and burned them to subdue the Navajos. So those were brought by the Europeans, and so were the honeybees, of course.
Well, we can also argue, if we're going to go down to the road, on the road of mentioning that the honeybees are non-native, neither are a lot of the people that live in the United States now.
Right? Exactly. We are the quintessential example of an invasive species. We exterminated millions of Native Americans with disease and superior guns, weapons. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't because our culture was more benign, or obviously we weren't very compassionate. We killed millions of natives. And so we are a quintessential example of an invasive species. And well, we don't have to continue that. We can start to treat life as, let's see how we can all integrate. Like right now, we're trying to integrate feral hogs into seen, and that's not going so well. The feral hogs are doing a lot of damage, and it's been shown that when you hunt them, their populations increase. The little breeding, forget what they call them, pods of hogs, when you go in and shoot a bunch of them, they spread out and they all start their own. And you actually wind up with more hogs after you allow hunting than you had before you allowed hunting. So hogs are turning into be very intractable. We can't seem to get rid of them. So that is an invasive species, but they may serve a purpose. At any rate, here we are. How are we going to live with who is here now?
Hey, by the way, did you know that there are a lot of cattle in the United States, right? There's a lot of breed. Did you know that none of them are native to the United States?
Cattle, sheep,
Richard's laughing. Right? I mean, so
cattle,
that's
sheep, horses, goats, all brought over from other countries. Natives didn't have horses until the Spanish brought them. Yeah, absolutely. So I think of horses as being very Texan culture and very cowboy culture. But you know, who came up with it? Where did the word rodeo come from? Rodeo, from the roundabout, from Spain, from Spanish. The first cowboys in the United States were Spanish vaqueros, and they taught the gringos about lasso and lariat. Those are all Spanish words.
mm-hmm.
The dale welter, go around the circle, dale vuelta. That's all from Spanish, because they were the first cowboys in the Americas. Yeah, so what do? We don't overpopulate. That does wind up being a question. Is there a carrying capacity for honeybees? If we exceed the carrying capacity, I could see us putting stress on native bees, because what little nectar's out there, we're soaking it all up, and we're slightly overpopulated. And that sometimes becomes an issue of, just being sensitive to how many bees you have and noticing, well, for instance, in New Mexico, we used to have bee yards where there would be 100 beehives in one bee yard. And they used to all make honey. And then as the climate changed, they started not making honey and needing feeding. Now all of a sudden 100 beehives in one bee yard, when they need feeding and they're robbing, becomes a terrible liability instead of a wonderful blessing, right? So you wind up decreasing the population because you've overextended the carrying capacity for honeybees in that place. That was in southern New Mexico, where when the mesquite would bloom, they would make literally barrels of mesquite honey. And then later the salt cedar would bloom. They would make many barrels of salt cedar honey. An old friend of mine used to tell me he used to go down there and make lots and lots of honey. Ursula Edwards, he was 80 back in the 60s, so he's of course long gone, but she told me that mesquite honey was bright yellow, very delicate in flavor, very quick to crystallize. Salt cedar honey came into bloom right after the mesquite, and it was greenish black, had bitter overtones. They considered it baker's honey. They didn't consider it worth very much. And he said, if you have to time your harvest, as soon as the mesquite starts tapering off, harvest your honey. Because if they mix in a little bit of salt cedar, it's going to be salt cedar honey. 1 quart of salt cedar honey in a barrel of mesquite, now you have a barrel of salt cedar honey, which is what they say about a barrel of water. If you pour in a quart of sewage, now you have a barrel of sewage. So that was his comment on that. But those were the days when it was easy to keep bees. It isn't that's never happened in New Mexico again. Those big honey flows are way over. I tasted a honey in New Mexico once at a meeting. I was just a kid. I was a teenager. I went with my boss to a meeting, And Ursel Edwards, that old man, brought some honey and passed it around and gave everybody a taste. And the old-time beekeepers who had kept bees in the 40s tasted the honey and said, Ursel, this is yellow top. Where did you get it? And Ursel said, well, I've been saving it since 1945. This was probably 70 something. And he said, I knew that the only people in the world that would appreciate it are some of you fellas right here, because I don't know if it's ever going to be made again. So in the 40s, certain rainfall patterns would hit, and the whole desert would turn bright yellow with a little tiny flower called Bailey multiradiata that would just paint the whole desert for miles bright, bright yellow. And they made a very special, extremely unique honey from what they called yellow top that has not been made since the 40s. And I don't know if if it's ever coming back. Those are times long gone. But what we can do is we can start appreciating the honey that we get, noticing the flowers, growing more flowers, being sensitive to carrying capacity, and then leading the world away from toxicity. That's where we come in as treatment-free beekeepers who don't want to use miticides, insecticides, antibiotics, all those kinds of things in our beekeeping. We want to raise bees that can live with flowers and nature entirely on their own, and they are raising themselves to do that. So all we have to do is not get out of the way or help a little bit and consciously help instead of fighting nature by raising bees with all these pesticides, and recognize that the bees already struggle with pesticides. We don't need to add to it. We need to advocate to get rid of pesticides. We need to help fund research to find non-toxic solutions to pests. There are pests that are agricultural pests that would, if let go, they would make us starve. So we need to find organic alternatives, and organic farmers have found many organic alternatives. They may raise costs and complicate things a little bit, but they work. There are wasps that love to eat predators. There are insects that love to eat aphids. All we need to do is learn how to enhance the environment to encourage the predators of the pests, because the use of pesticides actually destroys the predators of the pests more effectively than it destroys the pests. And then the pests can come back predator-free with a vengeance, and then the pests can work on becoming resistant to our pesticides, and now we're fighting nature and we're going to lose. We are losing. We are poisoning ourselves, we're poisoning the birds, we're poisoning all the insects. We're facing this insect apocalypse because of our overuse of toxicity.
So the one theme strikes me in what you're saying here, Les, and while I'm mentioning that, I wanted to remind everybody, if you have questions, just ask them in your comments in Zoom and on YouTube. And I want to say hi to my friend James, who joined us as well here in Texas on YouTube. Excuse me. But the main theme that I'm picking up on what you're talking about is that we need to be mindful that we're squeezing our environment for resources, we're poisoning it, and maybe somewhere the argument is not the honeybees are bad for the native bees, but we should work towards improving the environment for all the bees. And because before the advancement of heavy pesticides, monocultures, habitat loss, destructions of nesting zones, lack of diversity with those those deserts of monocultures, we didn't have problems between bees of any kind. They were living harmoniously together. We had plenty of insects flying around, and it appears that it's not necessarily the honeybees, which have been there since the 1600s, that are the origin of this, right? Because these developments are fairly recent. So I think that a lot of that kind of came about when there was some initiatives about pollinators and honeybees launched a few years back, a presidential campaign, a memorandum or something for health of honeybees and pollinators that kind of started triggering some of, excuse me, criticism of honeybees because of the juxtaposition of the impact. But you talked also about things like there might not be getting the same resources. So there's some partitioning happening also between native bees and honeybees, and even between native bees themselves, because they don't all eat the same thing. Some of them are very specialized. The honeybees have physical limitations in some instances, where their tongues are sometimes too short for some of the plants out there. And then there's also time of the day, for example, where native bees will come out, where the honeybees are not necessarily foraging, and then potentially there's some seasons that are more adapted to some of the other native bees. So it's kind of like all kinds of things that come at play. But again, I wanted to remind everybody, I don't think that this is caused by the honeybees as much as it is caused by humans, right?
Right. And, years ago, I had a man from the University of New Mexico where I got my degree in biology there and was still involved a little bit with the biology department. And a man asked me to bring bees up into the mountains above Albuquerque, New Mexico, the Sandia Mountains, because he was studying hummingbirds and he wanted to bring the bees in. He was measuring the flower nectar with these tiny little glass tubes. They would poke into the nectary. He'd bag the flower so that nothing would get the nectar. And then he'd poke these little tubes in and measure how much nectar they were making. And he wanted to bring the bees in so that they depressed the nectar and made the hummingbirds leave the study area up in the mountains. So I said, okay, I'll bring the bees up there and we'll do this, Now we had to hang the bees in a tree because there was lots of bears in those mountains. And I didn't want to feed any bears with my bees. So we hung the bees up in the tree. These were Langstroth hives back in those days. And then he called me about 2 weeks later and he said I could come and get him. And I said, so how'd it go? And he said, well, it didn't work. What do you mean it didn't work? Well, the hummingbirds are working these flowers called scrophularia. They're kind of a reddish native flower. And the bees are all working on the roadside, sweet clover and alfalfa. And they're not depressing the nectar of the scrophularia. And I said, well, it did work. We learned something. We just didn't learn what you thought we would learn. And he said, well, the bees are invasive species. And I looked at him and I said, so what's your family background?
Yeah, to my point earlier, right?
Yeah, and he looked at me kind of like, okay, never mind, just come and get your bees. And he paid me, of course, and I went and got my bees. But to me, what we learned was that they were working completely different flowers, and that our honeybees are not necessarily competing with hummingbirds in the mountains. Well, I'm glad to know that. The sweet clover and the alfalfa that they were working on also came from Europe. So here's some European honeybees working European flowers in the Sandia Mountains above Albuquerque, New Mexico. This was back in maybe the 80s or so, after I graduated from university. I graduated in 1981, so it was shortly after that. So that's an example of we've just complicated and maybe even enriched the biological environment of those mountains by adding those flowers and those bees. And now there's more species. And really, by nature standards, an ecology is considered rich if there's more and more and more species living in the same place, because more species all take advantage of little niches and make more efficient absorption of the water more efficient absorption of the light to make sugars. And so the more complicated a ecosystem is, often the more thorough and complete it is, and the more rich it is, and more resilient when
Well,
things get stressed.
and what about honeybees pollinating more crops and more a diversity of food that's helping the animal population, like you said earlier, with the birds and everything. And so that's kind of like that cycle that's being fostered that can potentially create more opportunities for the bees, the native bees as well. But the bottom line is that even if there were some impact on the native bees, it's mostly, again, because of environmental factors. Because again, the bees, the honeybees, they've been around for hundreds of years in the United States, and not until recently have we seen those issues. So really, there's some other issue at stake. So I think that we don't have to be tribal about it. And to your point, planting for all pollinators, including native bees and honeybees, throughout the season, a variety of things, and that's how people can best help instead of fighting, right? That's how they can help the native.
You know, one example of what you were just talking about makes sense to me is the almonds.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the 40s, you didn't pay for almond pollination, it just occurred. You planted almond trees and they were full of bees, all kinds of bees and wasps, and you got pollinated and you didn't even think about pollination. Pollination was a benefit of being in nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then as the almond orchards grew and the pesticides grew, and then we were starting to use herbicides and fungicides and more besides, now all of a sudden the trees come into bloom and there's no bees of any kind because we've destroyed the habitat, we've poisoned, we grow these flowers and we spread poison all over them and, you know, kill the pollinators and then wonder what's the matter with the pollinators. And now they're spending $400 an acre on pollination because they have destroyed their habitat for the native bees and the honeybees. And then they're wondering, why do we have to pay so much for pollination? Well, quit killing bees and you won't have to, you'll get natural pollination back again. That's nature is waiting to restore itself. All we have to do is reseed and find better ways of not killing insects, and we'll get that natural pollination back again from all the native bees and the honeybees and all the wasps and all that, all those good, wonderful creatures. You know, there was a commercial beekeeper that's made a lot of little films. He was in Pennsylvania.
John Miller and the More Than Honey.
No, yeah, that's another interesting one. They often interview a Pennsylvanian long-term beekeeper that he said, you know, I used to drive en route to pollination. My windshield would be just splattered with moths and all kinds of insects. He did a lot of driving at night, and he was driving in rural areas. So now I rarely ever get any insects splattering my windshield. Well, that's a bad sign. That means when we know by measurement that we have greatly reduced the insect population of the United States, and especially in our agricultural areas. The agricultural areas of the United States are the most toxic places in the world to keep bees. You can only bring them in during bloom, and then you got to get them out of there. I was involved in almond pollination, and the contracts would say, once we decide it's time for you to leave, we have 24, or you could try to get 48 hours notification. And then if they spray, that's your fault because you didn't get them out in time. So you need to have your trucks running, your forklifts working, your help lined up. So when they say, okay, move the bees out, you get in there that night, put the bees on the truck and get out of there because they're going to spray. And if you sign that contract, and you can't get your bees out of there and they spray, that's tough luck because you didn't get your bees out in time. And now there's no bees in that area because they killed everything. And then they wonder why it's cost so much to get pollination. Well, it's lucky we have it at all. It's hard work and it's not fun moving bees, hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of colonies all up and down the highways from Florida to California. That's not fun. That's hard work.
Right.
I really respect the guys that do it. And that's how we get to eat almonds and drink almond milk and all that. But we need to work on a better way to grow almonds. And we are. And the almond growers are even doing it.
By the way, almond trees are not native to the Americas. They're native to Iran. So, Steve, I missed your question. I apologize, but I'm going to read it now. We have a colony in a tuber hive that was a removal colony last August. Colony grew to 6 bars, but has grown no larger. When we looked on Saturday, there was very little capped honey. The resources are very low. What should we do now? Feed the bees all winter, combine with a stronger hive, and I know what I'm going to advise, but Les, I'm going to let you kind of take the lead on this.
Well, if they build up to 6, that's pretty good from in August, because that was at the end of any honey flow. So they did pretty good. If there is some capped honey, they're hanging on.
Very little.
Yeah, so that they may need to be fed a little bit. I wouldn't feed them a lot. I'd feed them 2-to-1 syrup or something with not much, excuse me, not much water in it. But just try to feed them like a quart every couple of weeks or so if they need it. But as soon as, if you're in the Austin, Texas or San Antonio area, it isn't that long now before a new bloom starts. Dandelions are blooming around me right now.
I think they are confused, though. They're a little confused. I think that the vegetation is kind of, some trees are losing their leaves now. Some are, the persimmons are flowering. There's a little bit of confusion.
Your persimmons are flowering?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Wow, that is a bit confused.
So yeah, I go ahead, Les, and then I can.
Well, my granddaughter notices all the dandelions, so she points out dandelions to me. And so they're in full bloom around here, So in some respects, don't fear that the environment is going to be terrible until April. Mm-hmm. There's bloom coming along, and feed them minimally just to make sure that they didn't starve to death. I bet they'll make it. The bees are pretty tough. These native bees. If you did a removal, you got some tough bees that know how to really restrict their population and get by on very minimal bits of honey. And once the honey flow starts, they'll quickly expand and take off again. Mm-hmm. So don't give up the faith. Maybe feed them a little bit before they, starve to death on you or something. But
or you can steal some resources from a colony that has plenty and give them a couple of bars of honey, one on each side of the bird's nest, and kind of insulate them at the same time, right?
If you've got that, that's the best.
Right. But the other thing I would say is that either you have enough bees, the population is important as well, but either your bees will do well on a small population or they won't. And if they have large enough population, chances are they're going to make it, so you don't need to be combining. If they don't, then you're not really gaining anything by combining them, really, and giving them to another colony. You might as well try to give them a chance to see if they're going to make it through, right? So, and you can always combine in the spring if they're really long. So I tend to agree with you, Les. I tend to not want to combine or do anything, and see if even the small colonies, as long as there's no draft, which is what kills colonies, are going to make it on small populations. And small populations also means fewer mouths to feed, right?
Right, and these bees naturally get down to a pretty small population. Sometimes they get so small they can't keep warm if it gets exceptionally cold, and that's a bit of an issue. So that's the other end of the spectrum. That's why tropical bees can get very, very small because they don't generally have a winter to worry about. And temper bees stay large enough to make a winter cluster. And temper bees need a lot more honey to get through the winter because they keep that larger cluster going. And it just is a bigger fire that needs more fuel. Whereas tropical bees can get down to a really small population, but that makes them not very good at winter. But so far we haven't had much of a winter. We haven't frozen at all yet here in San Antonio. I don't know where this person is, but
that Steve is in Houston. He's at the Shambayamani Farmers Peace Program. Steve Ewing. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So he's our friend Steve that we know. Yeah.
Yeah, and you, if anything, have less winter than we do. So
right. Yeah. So there you go. Hopefully that answers that question. Monty saying, I regularly see multiple variety of native bees and other native pollinators in my backyard foraging alongside the honeybees or right around the hives. It's anecdotal, but all seem to coexist well, right? And usually you see more native bees when the bees are thriving, because that means there's more food and fewer pesticides, right?
right. And we can plant things. We should really dig up our lawns. That's I get in trouble because I don't respect my. I live in a neighborhood with an HOA, and they have a lawn requirement that I just totally don't get. But if we could only dig up the lawns and plant native bushes and any bushes that help bees. You know, when I say the word native, there's a few people that are going to go, oh, it doesn't have to be native because they're anti-nativists. But whatever, just tough stuff that doesn't need a lot of water and finicky. So these lawns, you have to pour water all over them, fertilize them. I was told at one point, oh, there's grubs in your lawn because there's little brown spots, and that I should poison the grubs. Well, I'm not going to poison the grubs. So I just said, okay, thank you for your advice. And I ignored it. And then I noticed that there were little holes in the lawn, little bits of dirt dug up. And I came out one night, and there was a skunk that could smell the grubs in the grass. And they're not very deep. And he would dig up the grub and eat him. I thought, well, I'm not going to mention that to the neighbor, though, because then he'll want me to shoot the skunk. I'm not going to shoot the skunk either. This
or
is
trap
nature.
them or something. Yeah.
I love nature, and nature's taking care of the grubs for me. And I just as soon not have a lawn anyway.
I think that it's we don't think about the bigger picture, how we are all interconnected, how everything is kind of touching each other, right? Not that way, but you know, like the grubs and the skunks and the dandelions, everything is connected, right?
Right.
And so when we try to interject ourselves and take over, we forget about the unintended consequences and what else we're impacting that can have a very negative effect on the entire cycle, right? So sometimes we mean well, but it doesn't mean that it's a good thing. I'm sorry, I'm kind of distracted because I'm reading three things at the same time. And Steve was asking, feeding with sugar syrup, is that what you meant, Les? He couldn't understand what was said.
Yeah, I would probably put a quart. My simple thing is to get a soup container, and Natalie knows where to get those, or a Tupperware container that holds about a quart, poke some tiny little holes in it, mix up some sugar syrup that's 2 to 1, 2 parts sugar to 1 part water, and then fill that, turn it upside down so the tiny little holes become like a vacuum feeder. Put it up on some sticks so the bees can get under the lid and sip the nectar, the syrup through the holes, just to keep them alive. If you have honey, you can feed them honey. That's much more expensive. I know a lot of books will tell you never feed bees honey, but I've fed bees honey all the time. That's better for them, as long as it's real honey. The problem is, you go to the store, you don't know if you're actually getting honey or not. Probably not.
Right.
But and I used to feed them crystallized honey. Just you could just, if it's jar is thoroughly crystallized, just open it, tip it on its side, and they'll just mine it out. And it doesn't even have to, you don't have to have a fancy feeder or anything. Just something to get them by until the flowers come in. But I bet in Houston you're going to have some blooms, and they'll do pretty well.
So Steve, hopefully that answers that. But again, if you have extra honey, maybe that you've frozen for the spring or whatever, or if you have colonies that have lots of honeycombs, just steal a couple. That's the easiest anyway. And that's probably the best for the bees in the long run. If you don't have, then, follow the advice that we just gave you. Okay, so Brad says, I never feed mine, but I can't see yours, so you'll have to figure it out for yourself. It depends also on your comfort level. But to Les's point, they're very resilient. So especially we're in a warm climate, so they don't need as much to get by. So, and then Les Steve says, thank you for the clarification. So I don't have any questions on YouTube, by the way. If you guys have questions, just feel free to ask them and we'll take it from there. But we just want to make sure that we're mindful of those native bees, but at the same time that we need to keep in mind that the honeybees are feeding us, and there's a lot of things that are noticed because of the impact on the honeybees, right? So
right, but and the other thing is that we often have this sort of anti-wasp approach while we're keeping bees.
yes,
I know a lot of beekeepers that, there's a wasp nest under the beehive or near the beehive, and they want to kill the wasps and even spray the wasps right there in the bee yard. A lot of those wasps are not that big of a deal. I've had wasps crawl on my hand and lick honey off my fingers. I rarely ever get stung by a wasp. Now, they are more inclined to sting than honeybees because they don't lose their stinger when they sting. But most of those wasps, like the paper wasps, to build a little paper nest, are predators of caterpillars. And so they're actually out there. I've used them in New Mexico to raise corn, and I raised a bunch of paper wasps, but just made a space for them to make their nests and encourage them to make their nests. And if they're making their nest right over your door, all you have to do, if you catch it early, is knock it down with a broom. They'll fly away and they'll go build their nest somewhere else because they'll say, that's not a very safe place. But paper wasps are beautiful creatures that serve a purpose. And they will eat corn earworms. They will find them in the corn, pull them out, paralyze them, and feed them to their babies at their nest. So a lot of these wasps are beneficial, amazing creatures that the world needs, and we fear them all as if they're out to sting us. The last thing they want to do is bother with us. They just want to feed their babies and survive and reproduce, just like the rest of us.
And they keep a lot of the pests at bay sometimes as well, right? So
absolutely, and they're beautiful. I've had a trencher hawk wasp walk on my hand and lick nectar on my finger. It was 3 inches long, probably a 4-inch wingspan, bright metallic dark blue with reddish wings and clear and red tinted wings. Just an amazing creature, as big as a hummingbird in many respects. It's just a beautiful, beautiful creature. And they hunt tarantulas. They find tarantulas, sting them in their nerve ganglia, their brain, with a neurotoxin, and then carry them, dig a hole, bury them. They're paralyzed. The tarantula is not dead, it's paralyzed. Lay an egg on it, and then cover the hole. The egg hatches and eats the tarantula, and then pupates and comes out of the hole, either male or female. If it's a male, it mates with females and dies. Female then is pregnant and starts hunting tarantulas to go and feed its babies. So, and velvet ants, by the way, ants are 100% social. All ants are social.
Right.
When we see velvet ants, we like to call them solitary ants, but they're actually wasps. Genetically, when you work it out, they turn out to be a wingless wasp that is a solitary wasp. They're the beautiful, some of them get pretty large here in Texas. They're like velvety colored, often bright red, bright blue. And you just see them kind of zooming along, walking real determined and fast, like they know right where they're going. And they are predators also. And they can sting, by the way. I've picked them up and they can really sting pretty well.
So I love, we're going to have to do recordings of all the sound effects from Les. There's the chainsaw, there's the ants now, there's the sparklers, there's all kinds of things. I love it, Les. That's amazing. So Monty's saying, by the way, he loves watching the wasps hunt caterpillars on these cabbages, to your point, right?
Absolutely.
And then and I don't know if you know that, but there's some native bees that are actually very aggressive. There's a couple of species that are really doing a number on other bees. There's in particular the European wool carder. The male is very territorial and it will fight and even kill other bees. So that's something that the honeybees don't necessarily do. And then there's also a sculptured resin bee. It's called the Megachile supersculpturalis. And what it does is it attacks the carpenter bees and basically gunks it up in resin and then it coats them and just basically, takes over the nest. Whereas the honeybees only defend themselves, their home, right? They don't go and attack. They're not aggressive like others.
Right. Oh, there's so many beautiful types of bees and fitting all kinds of niches, and there are hyperparasites. There are parasites of the wasps that are parasites of bees. There's the aghnumid wasp. Way back when I was a kid, that first lit my fire about wasps. I saw it fly past me and it was dragging a filament. And I thought, what the heck? And I watched the wasp and it went to my mom's peach tree. And it started clasping the peach tree with its antenna as it walked around. And it had this long filament hanging off its abdomen. At some point, it seemed to get excited and do like a figure eight. And it raised the filament and started boring it into the tree trunk. I thought, wow, it's stinging my mom's tree. Maybe I should swat it. I was 6 or 8 at the time, But I had a bug book and I couldn't read, but I knew all the pictures in that book by heart. So ran up and got my bug book, came back, and I found it. Turns out that the aghnumid wasp can feel the peach tree borer boring through the cambium layers under the bark with its antenna. It can figure out where it is. It shoots its ovipositor through the bark, drills it into the peach tree borer larvae, shoots an egg into the peach tree borer larvae, pulls its ovipositor out, and goes off to find another borer. The egg hatches, eats the peach tree borer, and emerges as an aghnumid wasp to go and hunt more borers. So there's another example of a beautiful wasp that doesn't sting people at all and gets rid of peach tree borers naturally. So we could grow them and take care of our those borers affect any stone fruit, plums and peaches and any stone fruit. So we could use them, employ them, but when we spray the orchard, we kill them. Now we've killed the predators of our enemy more effectively than we've killed our enemy. The enemy will be back quick. Predator takes several years to come back. So we've got to learn a better way to deal with nature.
So with all this information, we've gone back and forth a little bit for and against in both cases. I would say to conclude, I think that we need, as beekeepers especially, to be advocates for all pollinators. There's all kinds of things we can talk about our neighbors, when it comes to planting for forage. There's a great list for Texas anyway on our website under be-mindful.com, and look at resources. There's a planting list for pollinators with seasons they're blooming and all kinds of information. We can also talk about decrease our own usage of pesticides. So campaign together instead of fighting between ourselves, between nativists and non-nativists. And we don't have to be tribal. We can rise together, right, Les? And then there's also, I wanted to mention, there's a great book if you are interested in helping out native pollinators. There's all kinds of things that you can do. And that book has been written by Eric Matter and Marla Spivak, who's basically very known in the United States, and Ellen Evans, and it's called Managing Alternative Pollinators. So if you're interested and want to learn more about that, that's one of the books that you can look into. And there's also the Xerces Society has other books on native bees that I encourage you to go and take a look at. But we don't have to be pitting each other against each other, right? We can just work together and protect all pollinators, right, Les?
Because here we are. We all need to live together. We're not going back to pre-Columbian times. We're going forward into new times together. Let's all rise together.
That's right. So with those wise words and those words of wisdom, basically, Les, I wanted to thank you. I know you have been sick for a little bit and you've been up and down, and I really appreciate you being here, making it through despite, all that. And I want to thank everybody for their questions. And Les, with that, let's rise together, right?
It sounds good. And we'll rise until next week, and we'll see y'all next week.
Very good.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Come on back. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Like our videos if you want more, and push the notification bell for when we come on live. And just let us know if you have any questions. We're here for you guys. Have a good night. Bye. Bye, guys. Thank you, James. Thanks, Monty.
Bye, guys.
Bye, Brad. I got to find my Zoom. I don't know where it's at.
Oh yeah, go ahead and kill me. Go ahead and zap me.
You guys have a good night.
You have a plan for the rain Saturday?
I will take it offline. Hang